The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the royal palace as Lady Elena Vasquez walked through the corridors that had once been forbidden to her. Just 6 months ago, she had been nothing more than the daughter of a minor nobleman from the southern provinces. Now, she wore silk gowns adorned with precious stones and carried herself with the confidence of someone who shared the king's bed. King Marcus Aurelius stood at the window of his private chambers, watching the gardens where his late wife used to spend her mornings. Queen Isabella had been dead for 8 months now, and the grief still hit him in unexpected waves. She had been more than his wife. She had been his closest advisor, his anchor in the stormy seas of ruling a kingdom. Her death from a sudden illness had left him hollow, desperate for something to fill the emptiness that consumed him. That was when Elena had appeared at court. She had arrived with her father, Count Vasquez, during a routine diplomatic visit. Unlike the other noblewomen who threw themselves at the grieving king, Elena had been different. She listened when he spoke, offered gentle counsel, and never pushed for more than he was willing to give. Her beauty was undeniable. Dark hair that caught the light like polished ebony, green eyes that seemed to hold secrets, and a figure that moved with natural grace. What Marcus didn't know was that Elena's arrival had been carefully planned. Count Vasquez was drowning in debt, his lands mortgaged to the point of bankruptcy. The family's once proud name meant nothing without gold to back it up. Elena had been raised with one purpose: to secure a wealthy marriage that would save her family from ruin. When Queen Isabella fell ill, Elena saw her opportunity. She had studied the queen from afar, learning her habits, her preferences, even the way she spoke. Elena practiced compassion and wisdom in front of her mirror, perfecting the art of appearing to be everything the king had lost. She learned which books the queen had loved, what music had made her smile, and how she had advised the king on matters of state. Elena crafted herself into a replacement, a balm for the king's wounded heart. The plan worked perfectly. Within 2 months of the queen's death, Elena had caught the king's attention. Within 4, she had become his lover. By the 6th month, she held the unofficial position of royal consort, though no formal announcement had been made. The court whispered that it was only a matter of time before the king remarried. Elena's chambers were located in the east wing of the palace, close enough to the king's quarters to be convenient, but far enough to maintain some appearance of propriety. She had been given a staff of 12 servants, a personal guard, and access to funds that would have fed her father's province for a year. To the outside world, she appeared grateful and humble, often remarking how honored she was by the king's favor. But privately, Elena burned with ambition. The temporary nature of her position gnawed at her constantly. She was a consort, not a wife. She had influence but no real power. Most importantly, she had access to wealth but no legal claim to it. If the king tired of her, or if he died unexpectedly, she would be sent away with nothing more than the clothes on her back. It was during one of her evening walks through the palace that Elena first laid eyes on Queen Isabella's private treasury. She had been returning from the king's chambers when she noticed a door she had never seen open. Through the crack, she glimpsed something that made her heart race: the glint of gold and the sparkle of precious stones. The treasury was legendary throughout the kingdom. Queen Isabella had been known for her exquisite taste and her collection of jewelry, art, and precious objects from around the world. She had been given presents by foreign dignitaries, had commissioned pieces from the finest craftsmen, and had inherited treasures that had been in the royal family for generations. The collection was said to be worth more than some entire kingdoms. Elena learned from the palace servants that the treasury had been sealed since the queen's death. King Marcus had not been able to bear the thought of going through his wife's possessions, so everything remained exactly as she had left it. The royal treasurer, Master Thomas, held the only key and had strict orders that no one was to enter without the king's direct command. That night, Elena lay in her silk sheets planning. She needed to see what was in that treasury. She needed to understand exactly what treasures lay behind that locked door. But more than that, she needed to find a way to claim some of those riches for herself and her family. The next morning brought unexpected opportunity. King Marcus announced that he would be traveling to the northern borders to inspect the military fortifications there. The journey would take 2 weeks, and he would be bringing only a small retinue of essential advisors and guards. Elena would remain at the palace to rest, as the rough traveling conditions would be too harsh for a lady of her delicate constitution. Elena played her part perfectly, expressing disappointment at being separated from the king but understanding the necessity. She kissed him goodbye at the palace gates, standing with tears in her eyes as his carriage disappeared down the road. As soon as he was out of sight, she wiped her eyes dry and returned to her chambers with a new sense of purpose. Master Thomas was an old man who had served the royal family for 30 years. He was honest, loyal, and absolutely devoted to the memory of Queen Isabella. Elena knew that approaching him directly would be useless. Instead, she began to work on his assistant, a young man named Peter who had been recently appointed to help manage the royal accounts. Peter was barely 20, eager to please, and clearly overwhelmed by his new responsibilities. Elena had noticed how he looked at her during court functions, the way his eyes followed her movements, and how he blushed when she spoke to him directly. She began her campaign slowly, asking Peter for small favors, praising his intelligence and dedication, and gradually drawing him into her web. 3 days after the king's departure, Elena made her move. She sent word to Peter that she needed to speak with him privately about a matter concerning the royal household expenses. When he arrived at her chambers, she was dressed in a simple gown that somehow made her look more beautiful than any elaborate court dress ever could. She offered him wine and spoke to him about his work, showing genuine interest in the tedious details of palace accounting. Peter, flattered by her attention and slightly intoxicated by both the wine and her presence, began to relax his guard. Elena gradually steered the conversation toward the royal treasuries and the challenges of managing such valuable collections. "It must be so difficult for Master Thomas," she said, her voice filled with sympathy, "having to maintain the Queen's treasury without being able to properly catalog everything inside. The poor man must be losing sleep worrying about whether everything is still in its proper place." Peter nodded eagerly. "Oh, yes, my lady. He mentions it constantly. He hasn't been able to do a proper inventory since the Queen's death, and it weighs heavily on his mind." Elena leaned forward, her hand lightly touching Peter's arm. "Perhaps there's something we could do to help him. I know the king would be so grateful if someone could ease Master Thomas's burden during his absence." The suggestion was planted like a seed in fertile ground. Peter, desperate to prove his worth and eager to please the woman he was clearly infatuated with, began to consider possibilities. Elena didn't push. Instead, she let the idea grow naturally in his mind while she plied him with more wine and gentle encouragement. By the end of the evening, Peter had convinced himself that conducting a quiet inventory of the Queen's treasury would be a service to both Master Thomas and the king. Elena had carefully avoided making any direct requests or suggestions about her own involvement. Instead, she had simply expressed how much she admired people who took initiative and how she was sure the king valued those who went above and beyond their duties. The next day, Peter approached Master Thomas with his proposal. The old treasurer was initially resistant, but Peter's arguments were persuasive. An inventory would indeed be valuable, and if it was conducted quietly and professionally, there would be no harm done. Master Thomas was also feeling his age. The thought of having reliable help with such a massive undertaking was appealing. Elena waited patiently for 2 more days before making her next move. She encountered Peter in one of the palace corridors, seemingly by accident, and inquired about his work. When he mentioned the inventory project, She expressed fascination and wonder at what treasures the queen must have collected. "I wish I could see them," she said wistfully. "Queen Isabella had such exquisite taste. I've heard stories about her jewelry collection that sound almost too magnificent to be true." Peter's chest swelled with importance. Here was an opportunity to impress the king's consort while also showing off his newly granted access to the royal treasury. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "if you were to assist with the inventory, it would be educational for you to understand the extent of the royal collections." Elena's eyes widened with apparent surprise and delight. "Oh, but I couldn't possibly. I have no experience with such things. I wouldn't want to make any mistakes." Peter quickly reassured her that her assistance would be invaluable. Who better to appreciate the queen's taste in feminine treasures than another woman of refinement? Elena allowed herself to be persuaded, though she insisted that they must be very careful and professional about the entire process. The following morning, Elena found herself standing before the heavy oak door that led to Queen Isabella's private treasury. Peter turned the key with slightly shaking hands, and the door swung open to reveal wonders beyond even Elena's ambitious imagination. The room was larger than her entire childhood home had been. Glass cases lined the walls, each one filled with treasures that caught the morning light streaming through high windows. There were necklaces with emeralds the size of robins' eggs, tiaras that seemed to be made of captured starlight, and rings that held gems Elena couldn't even identify. Silk tapestries from distant lands covered the walls between cases, and carved chests held additional treasures that hadn't even been displayed. Elena had to steady herself against the door frame as the full magnitude of the wealth before her became clear. This wasn't just a collection. It was a fortune that could buy entire provinces. More than that, it was exactly what her family needed to restore their position and secure their future. She followed Peter through the treasury in apparent amazement, listening as he explained the cataloging system and the procedures they would follow for the inventory. Her mind, however, was racing ahead to more important considerations. How much could she take without it being noticed? How could she get the items out of the palace? Most importantly, how could she make it appear that she had every right to claim these treasures? As they worked through the first few display cases, Elena began to form a plan. It was ambitious and dangerous, but the potential rewards made the risks worthwhile. She would need to be patient, careful, and absolutely ruthless in its execution. The inventory would take several days to complete properly. That gave her time to study each piece carefully, to understand what was most valuable and what might be missed if it disappeared. More importantly, it gave her time to plant the seeds of legitimacy for her eventual claims. "Queen Isabella was so generous," Elena remarked as they catalogued a particular beautiful set of sapphire jewelry. "I've heard that she often gave gifts to ladies of the court who had served her well." Peter nodded absently, focused on his careful notes. "Oh yes, she was known for her kindness," Elena continued carefully. "I only wish I had been able to know her better. The king has told me so many stories about her wisdom and her generosity. He's mentioned that she had intended to make gifts to several people before her illness took her so suddenly." These casual comments, dropped throughout their work, began to build a foundation for what Elena had planned. She spoke of the queen's generosity, of gifts that might have been intended but never formalized, of the tragedy that the queen's final wishes might never be known. By the end of the third day, Elena had identified her targets. There were pieces that were magnificent but not unique, valuable but not historically significant, items that could conceivably have been personal gifts rather than crown jewels. She had also identified potential witnesses, servants who had worked closely with the queen, who might be convinced that they remembered conversations about intended gifts. Most importantly, Elena had begun to understand something crucial about the treasury itself. The inventory system, while detailed, was not perfect. Some items were recorded in multiple places, Others had vague descriptions that could apply to several similar pieces. In the organized chaos of centuries of accumulated treasures, a skilled manipulator could create confusion about what belonged where and to whom. As they finished their work for the day, Elena thanked Peter effusively for allowing her to assist with such important work. She spoke about how honored she felt to have seen the Queen's treasures and how much it had helped her understand the kind of woman Isabella had been. "The king will be so pleased to know that the inventory is being handled with such care," she said, her hand resting lightly on Peter's arm. "And I'm sure he'll be grateful to know that someone who truly appreciated the Queen's taste was involved in cataloging her most precious possessions." That evening, Elena sat in her chambers with parchment and ink, carefully documenting everything she had seen. She made detailed notes about which pieces would be most suitable for her purposes, which items were most valuable, and which could be taken with the least risk of immediate discovery. But more than that, Elena began to craft the narrative that would justify her actions. She would not simply steal the Queen's treasures. Instead, she would create a story in which she was the rightful recipient of gifts that the Queen had intended to make before her untimely death. She would find witnesses to support her claims and documents to back up her story. The king would return from his journey to find that his beloved consort had discovered evidence of his late wife's final wishes. Elena would present herself not as a thief, but as a faithful executor of the dead queen's generosity. It would be a performance that required perfect timing, flawless execution, and absolutely convincing emotion. As Elena blew out the candles in her chamber, she smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to advance her plan. Within a week, she would be laying the groundwork for the most audacious theft in the kingdom's history. And if everything went according to plan, no one would ever call it theft at all. The palace settled into quiet as night fell, unaware that in the East Wing chambers, a woman was planning to claim a dead queen's legacy as her own. The morning would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but Elena Vasquez had never been one to shy away from taking exactly what she wanted. Elena woke before dawn on the fourth day, her mind sharp with purpose. The king would return in 8 days, and she needed to move her plan from careful observation to active execution. She had spent the night refining her strategy, and now it was time to begin weaving the web of lies that would secure her family's future. Her first target was Margot, an elderly servant who had worked as Queen Isabella's personal maid for over 15 years. Margot was known throughout the palace for her devotion to the late Queen and her intimate knowledge of Isabella's daily routines and personal habits. If anyone could be convinced to remember conversations about gifts the Queen had intended to make, it would be Margot. Elena found the old woman in the laundry chambers, carefully pressing the king's linens with the same attention she had once given to the Queen's gowns. Margot looked up as Elena entered, her weathered face showing polite deference mixed with barely concealed suspicion. Like many of the older servants, Margot had reservations about the king's new consort appearing so soon after the Queen's death. "Good morning, Margot," Elena said, her voice warm and gentle. "I hope you don't mind me visiting you here. I've been hoping for a chance to speak with you privately." Margot set down her iron and curtsied slightly. "Of course, my lady. How may I serve you?" Elena moved closer, her expression becoming sad and thoughtful. "I've been thinking so much about Queen Isabella lately. The king speaks of her constantly, and I can see how much pain her loss still causes him. I wish I could have known her, could have learned from her wisdom." The mention of the Queen caused Margot's stern expression to soften. Despite her reservations about Elena, the old servant's love for her former mistress was stronger than her suspicions. "She was a remarkable woman, my lady," Margot said quietly. "Kind, intelligent, always thinking of others before herself. The kingdom lost a treasure when she passed, Elena nodded sadly. The king has told me about her generosity. He mentioned that she often spoke of wanting to help the families who had served the crown faithfully. It breaks my heart to think that her final wishes might have gone unfulfilled because of her sudden illness. Margot's eyes brightened at this topic. Oh yes, my lady. The queen was always thinking of ways to reward loyal service. She had such plans. The old woman's voice trailed off as emotion overcame her. Elena stepped closer, her voice becoming confidential. Actually, Margot, that's why I wanted to speak with you. I've been helping young Peter with the inventory of the Queen's treasury, and I've been wondering about some of the pieces. The king mentioned that Isabella had spoken of making gifts to certain people, but of course, her illness prevented her from following through. The seed was planted expertly. Elena didn't make any specific claims. She simply suggested that there might have been intentions that were never fulfilled. She let Margot's own memories and emotions fill in the gaps. I remember the queen mentioning that she wanted to recognize the families who had given so much to the crown, Margot said slowly. She was particularly concerned about ensuring that those who had made sacrifices for the kingdom wouldn't be forgotten. Elena's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. Do you remember her mentioning any specific families or individuals? I know the king would want to honor her wishes if we could determine what they were. Over the next 20 minutes, Elena carefully guided the conversation, leading Margot to remember fragments of conversations that could be interpreted as the queen's intentions to make gifts. Elena mentioned her own family's service to the crown, their financial difficulties, and her father's loyalty to the king. She painted a picture of a family that deserved recognition, all while never directly asking for anything. By the end of their conversation, Margot was convinced that she remembered the queen mentioning the Vasquez family specifically. Elena's gentle questions and emotional manipulation had created false memories that felt entirely real to the grieving servant. I do believe the queen mentioned your family, my lady, Margot said with growing certainty. She was concerned about Count Vasquez's situation and spoke of wanting to ensure your family's continued prosperity. I remember now. She said something about having pieces in her collection that would be perfect gifts for a family that had served so faithfully. Elena's eyes filled with tears that were only partly fabricated. Oh, Margot, if that's true, it would mean so much to know that the queen thought kindly of my family. But I would never want to claim anything that wasn't truly intended for us. Margot reached out and patted Elena's hand. My lady, if the queen intended those gifts, then it would be wrong not to fulfill her wishes. She would have wanted her treasures to help those who deserved them. Elena left the laundry chambers with the first piece of her plan in place. Margot would now swear that she remembered the queen's intentions to make gifts to the Vasquez family. The old servant's testimony would carry significant weight because of her reputation for honesty and her close relationship with the late queen. Her next target was Brother Marcus, the palace chaplain who had provided spiritual counsel to the queen during her final illness. The elderly priest was known for his integrity and his careful documentation of important conversations. If Elena could convince him that the queen had expressed certain dying wishes, his word would be almost unquestionable. Elena found Brother Marcus in the palace chapel, kneeling before the altar in his daily prayers. She waited respectfully until he finished, then approached with the humility appropriate for addressing a man of God. Brother Marcus, she said softly, I hope I'm not interrupting your devotions. I have something troubling my conscience that I hoped you might help me understand. The priest turned to face her, his kind eyes showing concern. Of course, my child. What weighs upon your heart? Elena had crafted this conversation carefully, knowing that Brother Marcus's dedication to truth and spiritual guidance would make him particularly susceptible to her manipulation. She spoke of her desire to honor the Queen's memory and her concern that some of Isabella's final wishes might have been overlooked in the chaos following her death. "I've been helping with the inventory of the Queen's possessions," Elena explained. "And I've been wondering about her intentions for some of the pieces. I know she spoke with you during her final days, and I wondered if she might have mentioned any specific gifts she wanted to make." Brother Marcus frowned thoughtfully. The Queen was very concerned about ensuring that her death wouldn't leave important matters unfinished. She spoke often of her desire to reward those who had served the crown faithfully. Elena nodded earnestly. "That sounds exactly like the woman the king has described to me. I've heard from some of the servants that she had mentioned wanting to help certain families, particularly those facing financial difficulties despite their loyal service." The priest's expression grew more interested. Yes, she was always concerned about families who had sacrificed for the kingdom. She felt that the crown had a duty to ensure their welfare. Elena proceeded carefully, using her knowledge of the Queen's character and the priest's own beliefs to construct a narrative that would feel authentic to him. She spoke of justice, of fulfilling the wishes of the dead, and of ensuring that generous intentions weren't lost simply because death had intervened. "I would never want to claim anything that wasn't truly intended for my family," Elena said, her voice heavy with apparent moral struggle. "But if the Queen did express such wishes, wouldn't it be wrong to ignore them? Wouldn't that be a betrayal of her memory?" Brother Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the spiritual and ethical implications of the situation. Elena had presented the dilemma perfectly, framing her potential claims not as greed but as religious duty. "If the Queen did express such wishes," the priest said slowly, "then yes, it would be important to honor them. The intentions of the dying carry great weight, particularly when they concern acts of generosity and justice." Elena spent another hour with Brother Marcus, carefully planting suggestions and allowing his own assumptions to build the case she needed. She never made direct claims about what the Queen had said. Instead, she asked questions and made observations that led the priest to draw his own conclusions. By the time she left the chapel, Brother Marcus was convinced that he remembered the Queen expressing concerns about the Vasquez family's welfare and her desire to ensure their continued prosperity. The priest's own commitment to justice and care for the faithful had made him an unwitting accomplice in Elena's scheme. With two crucial witnesses now prepared, Elena turned her attention to the more technical aspects of her plan. She needed documentation that would support her claims and make her story appear legitimate to anyone who might investigate. Late that night, Elena made her way to the palace archives, a vast collection of documents that recorded everything from royal proclamations to household expenses. The night guard was an old soldier named Captain Torres, who had served the royal family for decades and was known for his rigid adherence to duty. Elena had prepared for this encounter carefully. She approached Captain Torres with a letter that she had carefully forged, using techniques her father had taught her years ago when the family's financial difficulties had first begun. The letter appeared to be from Master Thomas, requesting that Lady Elena be given access to certain historical records related to royal gift-giving practices. "Captain Torres," Elena said with perfect calm, "Master Thomas asked me to research the proper procedures for documenting royal gifts. With the king's return approaching, he wants to ensure that all protocols are followed correctly." The forged letter was convincing enough to satisfy the guard's cursory inspection. Captain Torres, like most soldiers, was more concerned with keeping unauthorized people out than with the specific details of authorized research. He unlocked the archive doors and left Elena to her work, retiring to his post nearby. Elena moved quickly through the archive, searching for documents that could support her story. She found records of previous royal gifts, examples of the language used to document such transfers, and most importantly, several blank forms that had been used for official gift registrations. Working by candlelight, Elena carefully created the documents she needed. She forged a letter from Queen Isabella expressing her intention to make gifts to the Vasquez family, backdating it to just before the Queen's illness began. She created a partial list of specific items that the Queen had supposedly selected for this purpose, choosing pieces that she had already identified as suitable targets during her treasury inventory. The forgery was careful and convincing. Elena had studied the Queen's handwriting from other documents in the archive, and her father's lessons in document creation served her well. The letter looked authentic, complete with the proper royal seals and signatures. She also created supporting documentation that would explain why these gifts had never been formally processed. She forged correspondence between the Queen and Master Thomas about the intended gifts, making it appear that the Queen had died before the final paperwork could be completed. By dawn, Elena had created a complete paper trail that supported her claims. Anyone investigating would find what appeared to be legitimate documentation of the Queen's intentions, backed up by witness testimony from respected members of the palace staff. The next day, Elena returned to the treasury with Peter for what would be their final inventory session. She had already identified the specific pieces she would claim: a magnificent ruby necklace that had belonged to a foreign princess, a set of emerald jewelry that was beautiful but not historically significant, several rings with precious stones, and a small collection of gold ornaments that were valuable but not unique. As they worked, Elena began to prepare Peter for what she would reveal after the king's return. She spoke casually about the research she had been conducting, the conversations she had been having with longtime palace staff, and her growing understanding of the Queen's generous nature. "I've learned so much about Queen Isabella from the people who knew her best," Elena said as they catalogued items near the end of their work. "It's amazing how many people remember her speaking about wanting to help families who had served the crown faithfully." Peter nodded absently, focused on his careful documentation. Elena continued her gentle manipulation, planting the seeds that would make him a witness to her discovery of the Queen's intentions. "I keep thinking about what Master Thomas said about the importance of fulfilling the wishes of the dead," she continued. "It would be tragic if generous intentions were lost simply because death intervened before they could be carried out." By the end of the day, Elena had laid all the groundwork for her plan. She had witnesses who would swear to the Queen's intentions, documentation that appeared to prove her claims, and access to the treasury that would allow her to claim the pieces she wanted. That evening, Elena wrote a letter to her father, using a code they had developed years ago when their financial schemes required careful communication. She informed him that their family's future was about to be secured and instructed him to prepare to receive valuable items that would need to be quickly converted to gold and invested in legitimate properties. Count Vasquez received the letter 3 days later and immediately understood its implications. His daughter had found a way to claim royal treasures, and the family would finally escape the poverty that had threatened to destroy their noble status. He began making arrangements with discreet merchants and moneylenders who could handle valuable items without asking uncomfortable questions. Meanwhile, Elena spent her final days before the king's return, carefully rehearsing her performance. She practiced the exact words she would use to reveal her discovery of the Queen's intentions. She memorized every detail of the forged documents and prepared answers for any questions that might arise. She also began to subtly influence other members of the court, dropping hints about her research into the Queen's final wishes and her concern that some important matters might have been left unfinished. She created an atmosphere of anticipation, making it seem natural that significant revelations might emerge upon the king's return. Elena's maid, Maria, noticed her mistress's increased nervousness and excitement during these final days. When she asked if everything was well, Elena confided that she had discovered something important that might bring great honor to her family. "I believe I've found evidence of Queen Isabella's final wishes regarding gifts she intended to make," Elena told Maria in strict confidence. "If I'm right, it will mean that the Queen thought very highly of our family's service to the crown." Maria, loyal to her mistress and excited by the possibility of her family's elevation, promised to support Elena in any way necessary. This gave Elena another witness who could testify to her apparent surprise and delight at discovering the Queen's generous intentions. On the evening before the king's scheduled return, Elena made one final visit to the treasury. She stood among the glittering treasures that would soon be hers, imagining the wealth and security they would bring to her family. She had successfully created a web of lies so convincing that even she almost believed them herself. The next morning would bring the king home and Elena's plan into its final, most dangerous phase. She would need to perform flawlessly, convincing the grieving monarch that his beloved wife had wanted to honor Elena's family with precious gifts. The success of her scheme would depend on her ability to manipulate the king's love for his dead queen and his trust in the people who claimed to remember Isabella's final wishes. As Elena prepared for bed on her last night, as merely a consort with hopes and ambitions, she was confident that tomorrow would see her transformed into a woman of genuine wealth and power. The dead queen's treasures would become the foundation of the Vasquez family's restoration, and Elena would have successfully stolen a fortune while convincing everyone that she was simply honoring a generous woman's final wishes. The palace slept peacefully, unaware that morning would bring revelations that would shock the court and forever change the fate of the king's consort. The royal carriage rolled through the palace gates as the sun reached its zenith, carrying King Marcus home from his inspection of the northern fortifications. Elena waited in the main courtyard with other members of the court, her heart pounding with anticipation and carefully concealed fear. Today would determine whether her elaborate scheme would secure her family's future or destroy her entirely. The king looked tired from his journey, but his face brightened when he saw Elena among the assembled courtiers. She had dressed carefully for this moment, choosing a gown that was elegant but not ostentatious, jewelry that was beautiful but not presumptuous. She needed to appear as the devoted consort, grateful for his return and eager to share important discoveries she had made during his absence. After the formal greetings and the king's brief address to the assembled court, Elena approached him as he walked toward his private chambers. Her expression showed just the right mixture of joy at his return and barely contained excitement about something significant she needed to discuss. "My lord," she said, her voice warm with apparent relief. "I've missed you terribly, but I'm afraid I have something quite extraordinary to share with you. During your absence, I believe I've discovered something important about Queen Isabella's final wishes." King Marcus stopped walking, his attention immediately focused on Elena. Any mention of his late wife still had the power to capture his complete attention, and Elena had counted on this reaction. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice becoming intense with interest and concern. Elena took his arm gently, guiding him toward a more private area where they could speak without being overheard by other courtiers. "I've been helping young Peter with the inventory of the Queen's treasury, as you know. During that work, I began speaking with some of the palace staff who had served the Queen closely. What I learned has convinced me that Isabella had made plans for certain gifts before her illness prevented her from completing them." The king's expression grew more serious. "Tell me everything." Elena began her carefully rehearsed performance. She spoke of her conversations with Margot and Brother Marcus, presenting their memories as evidence of the Queen's generous intentions. She described her research in the archives and her discovery of documentation that seemed to support these accounts. "I found this among the archived papers," Elena said, producing the forged letter she had created. It appears to be in the Queen's hand, expressing her desire to make gifts to families who had served the crown faithfully despite personal hardships. King Marcus took the letter with trembling hands, his eyes filling with tears as he recognized what appeared to be his wife's familiar handwriting. Elena had studied Isabella's script carefully, and the forgery was convincing enough to fool even someone who had seen the Queen's writing countless times. "This is definitely Isabella's hand," the king said softly. "She always worried about ensuring that loyal families weren't forgotten or left to struggle in poverty." Elena nodded earnestly. "That's exactly what Margot and Brother Marcus remembered about her concerns. According to the letter, she had selected specific pieces from her collection to give to the families she mentioned. My own family appears to be among those she intended to honor." The king looked up from the letter, his expression showing both surprise and a kind of hopeful joy. The idea that he could fulfill his beloved wife's final wishes was clearly overwhelming to him. "Your family?" he asked. Elena's eyes filled with tears that were partly genuine emotion and partly calculated performance. "I couldn't believe it when I found the documentation, my lord. According to what I've discovered, the Queen was aware of my father's financial difficulties and his continued loyalty despite those hardships. She apparently selected several pieces from her collection as gifts that would help restore our family's stability." She showed him the additional forged documents she had created, each one carefully crafted to support her story. The king examined them with growing excitement, clearly seeing in them an opportunity to honor his wife's memory while also helping the woman who had brought him comfort in his grief. "If Isabella truly intended these gifts," the king said slowly, "then we must certainly fulfill her wishes. It would be wrong to let her generous intentions remain unfulfilled." Elena had to control her surge of triumph as she realized how completely the king had accepted her fabricated story. "I feel the same way, my lord, but I wanted to discuss it with you before taking any action. I would never want to claim anything that wasn't truly intended for my family." Over the next hour, Elena guided the king through the rest of her manufactured evidence. She brought him to speak with Margot, who earnestly repeated her memories of the Queen's intentions. They visited Brother Marcus, who spoke passionately about the importance of fulfilling the charitable wishes of the dead. The king was completely convinced. More than that, he was grateful to Elena for uncovering these forgotten intentions and giving him a way to honor his wife's memory. That evening, he ordered Master Thomas to prepare the necessary documentation to transfer the specified items to Elena's family. Master Thomas, however, was troubled by the request. As the royal treasurer, he had been responsible for all of the Queen's financial affairs, and he had no memory of any discussions about gifts to the Vasquez family. When he examined the documents Elena had provided, something about them seemed off, though he couldn't immediately identify what was bothering him. "Your Majesty," Master Thomas said carefully, "I want to ensure that we follow proper procedures for this transfer. These are valuable items from the royal collection, and I want to make certain that all documentation is completely accurate." The king, still emotional from his discovery of his wife's final wishes, was impatient with what seemed like bureaucratic delays. "Master Thomas, Lady Elena has provided clear evidence of the Queen's intentions. I see no reason to delay fulfilling Isabella's wishes." But Master Thomas had survived decades in royal service by being thorough and cautious. That night, he conducted his own investigation into Elena's claims. He examined the documents more carefully, spoke with other palace staff who had worked closely with the Queen, and reviewed the archive records where Elena claimed to have found her evidence. What he discovered filled him with alarm and anger. The documents showed signs of recent creation rather than age. The archive records showed no evidence of Elena's claimed research sessions, and Captain Torres admitted that he had allowed her access based on a letter that Master Thomas had never written. Most damning of all, several palace staff members who had worked closely with the Queen categorically denied Elena's claims about conversations and intentions they were supposed to have witnessed. The next morning, as Elena prepared for what she believed would be her triumphant claiming of the Queen's treasures, Master Thomas requested an urgent private audience with the king. What he revealed shattered Elena's carefully constructed world. "Your Majesty," Master Thomas said gravely, "I have conducted a thorough investigation into Lady Elena's claims about the Queen's alleged final wishes. I'm afraid I must report that her evidence appears to have been fabricated." The king's face went pale with shock and growing anger. "What are you saying?" Master Thomas methodically presented his findings. He showed how the documents had been forged, how the witness testimony had been manufactured through manipulation and suggestion, and how Elena had gained unauthorized access to both the treasury and the archives to support her deception. The servants who allegedly remembered the Queen's intentions were led to create false memories through Lady Elena's careful questioning, Master Thomas explained. Brother Marcus has now admitted that he never actually heard the Queen express any specific wishes about gifts to the Vasquez family. Lady Elena constructed those memories in his mind through skillful manipulation of his beliefs about charity and justice. As the evidence mounted, the king's shock transformed into a cold fury unlike anything the palace staff had ever seen. The realization that Elena had exploited his grief and manipulated his love for his dead wife was devastating. More than that, the discovery that she had involved respected palace staff in her deception and had violated the sacred treasury that held his wife's memory felt like a desecration of everything he held dear. Elena was summoned to the throne room, where she found the king waiting with Master Thomas and several guards. The atmosphere was so charged with royal anger that Elena immediately understood her scheme had been discovered. "Lady Elena," the king said, his voice cold with controlled rage, "Master Thomas has presented me with some very disturbing information about your recent activities." Elena's mind raced as she tried to salvage the situation. She could see from the king's expression that denial would be useless, but she attempted one final manipulation. "My lord, if there have been any irregularities in the documentation, I assure you they were innocent mistakes. My only desire was to honor Queen Isabella's memory and fulfill what I genuinely believed were her wishes." The king stood from his throne, his tall frame imposing in his fury. "Innocent mistakes? You forged documents in my dead wife's name. You manipulated faithful servants into believing lies. You violated the sanctity of Isabella's treasury and attempted to steal treasures that have been in the royal family for generations. And you did all of this while sharing my bed and accepting my trust." Elena realized that her situation was hopeless, but her desperation drove her to one final catastrophic mistake. Instead of showing remorse and begging for mercy, she allowed her anger at being discovered to override her judgment. "Your precious dead wife cared more about her jewels than she did about the living," Elena snapped. "My family has served this crown faithfully for generations while struggling with poverty. We deserved compensation for our loyalty, and if she had truly been the generous woman you claim, she would have provided it willingly." The silence that followed Elena's words was absolute and terrifying. Every person in the throne room understood that she had just committed an unforgivable sin. Insulting the memory of the beloved dead queen in front of her grieving husband was tantamount to signing her own death warrant. King Marcus's voice, when he finally spoke, was deadly quiet. "You dare to insult Isabella's memory while standing in the palace where she lived and died? You have the audacity to claim that your greed and treachery were somehow justified by my wife's imagined failings?" Elena finally understood the magnitude of her error. Her anger had led her to destroy any possibility of mercy or lenient punishment. She had not only been caught in an elaborate theft, but had compounded her crimes by attacking the memory of the woman the king had loved above all else. "Guards," the king commanded. "Arrest Lady Elena Vasquez for theft, forgery, and treason. She is to be confined immediately pending her trial and sentencing." As the guards moved toward her, Elena made one last desperate plea. "Please, my lord, think of my family. My father knew nothing of this. Don't let them suffer for my mistakes." The king's expression showed no trace of the compassion he had once felt for her. "Your family will indeed suffer for your actions. Count Vasquez will be stripped of his titles and lands as punishment for raising a daughter capable of such treachery. Your entire family will be banished from the kingdom permanently." Elena was dragged from the throne room in chains, her cries for mercy echoing through the corridors where she had once walked as an honored consort. The palace staff who witnessed her removal felt a mixture of satisfaction at seeing justice done and sorrow for the king's betrayal by someone he had trusted. The trial that followed was swift and decisive. The evidence of Elena's crimes was overwhelming, and her insult to the queen's memory had ensured that she would receive no sympathy from the court or the people. She was sentenced to permanent banishment under pain of death should she ever return to the kingdom. Count Vasquez and the rest of the Vasquez family were given 3 days to gather their personal belongings before being escorted to the kingdom's borders. Their titles, lands, and remaining wealth were confiscated by the crown. Elena's father, learning of his daughter's actions and their consequences, aged 10 years in as many days. On the morning of Elena's departure, she was brought to the palace gates in a plain cart, wearing the simple clothes of a commoner. The king came to witness her banishment personally, his face showing no emotion as the woman who had once shared his intimacy was driven away forever. Elena looked back at the palace as the cart carried her toward the border, seeing for the last time the wealth and power she had come so close to claiming. Her elaborate scheme had failed completely, leaving her with nothing but the shame of her crimes and the knowledge that her greed had destroyed her entire family. The king returned to his chambers after watching Elena disappear down the road, feeling a profound emptiness that went beyond even his grief for Isabella. Elena's betrayal had shown him how completely he had been manipulated in his vulnerability, and the knowledge that he had been used in such a calculating way left him questioning his ability to trust anyone again. Master Thomas supervised the return of Queen Isabella's treasury to its proper security, ensuring that every piece was accounted for and that new safeguards were put in place to prevent future violations. The room was sealed once again, and access was restricted to prevent any repetition of Elena's crimes. In the months that followed, stories of Elena's downfall spread throughout the kingdom, serving as a warning about the consequences of greed and the dangers of exploiting royal trust. The tale became particularly popular among the palace servants, who had witnessed firsthand how someone could rise to great heights only to fall even further because of their own ambitions. The king eventually remarried, choosing a princess from a neighboring kingdom whose family was known for their honor and integrity. He was much more cautious in his second marriage, having learned through bitter experience how completely someone could deceive him while appearing to care for his welfare. Elena herself disappeared into exile, her fate unknown to those in the kingdom she had tried to rob. Some said she died in poverty within a year of her banishment. Others claimed she found work as a servant in distant lands, her beauty faded and her noble pretensions stripped away by harsh reality. Count Vasquez lived just long enough to see his family's exile to a remote province in a foreign country, where they existed on the charity of distant relatives who barely acknowledged their relationship. The proud nobleman died, knowing that his daughter's crimes had destroyed everything his ancestors had built over generations. The Queen Isabella's treasury remained sealed for several more years, until the king finally felt ready to deal with his wife's possessions. When he finally opened the room again, he donated many of the treasures to churches and charitable institutions, fulfilling what he believed would have been his wife's true wishes for helping those in need. Elena's story became a cautionary tale told throughout the kingdom about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the inevitability of justice. It served as a reminder that even those who achieved great power and influence could lose everything through their own greed and deception. The palace continued its routines, but the memory of Elena's betrayal lingered as a warning to future courtiers about the consequences of exploiting royal trust. The king had learned to guard his heart more carefully, and those who served him understood that loyalty and honesty were the only qualities that could ensure their continued favor. In the end, Elena's elaborate scheme had accomplished nothing except the complete destruction of everything she had tried to protect. Her family was ruined, her reputation destroyed, and her dreams of wealth and security had been replaced by the harsh reality of permanent exile and disgrace. The dead queen's treasures remained where they belonged, protected by the justice of a king who had learned to see through the deceptions of those who would exploit his grief for their own gain.